I'd like to move over to Anthony now with CAFOD. Anthony, your article focuses on, Vero mentioned the interfaith dialogue and some of these reconciliation processes. And CAFOD and your partners have been involved in supporting this at national and local levels to help address trauma and promote social healing and cohesion. But this approach is actually challenged also by Joseph Zapater in his article. Joseph, I should mention, was a former protection cluster coordinator in CAR in the middle of the year. He argues that the roots of the conflict, and I don't think any of us would disagree with this, were much more nuanced than religious enmity, and that they were also very localized, and this resonates with what you and also Jenny and Alison have been saying. And he also points out that individuals, not communities, were guilty of committing atrocities, and that a reconciliation approach, in a sense, can ignore the desire for justice that many people have. So I just wanted to know how you would respond to those criticisms or challenges, and what evidence is there that these approaches are actually working? What have been some of the challenges that you've faced on the ground in terms of implementing this strategy?
Thank you, Wendy. I think I'd just like to start off by re-emphasizing a point that Veronique made, that these kind of interfaith dialogues, the reconciliation work that we're doing from the bottom up, should not be seen in isolation from any of the other wider protection strategies. And they form part of a wider solution to the conflict, which include individual cases around kind of mitigating risk, and also a wider strategy around restoring national security, creating a legitimate political process, and also addressing cases of impunity. So I'll start off by firstly addressing some of the concerns that Joseph raised with kind of the reconciliation approach before moving into kind of the impact that it's had on the ground. Firstly, I'd like to say that the Interreligious Platform from the very beginning has always emphasised and been quick to point out that as Joseph rightly argues, that the conflict is far more nuanced than just between Christians and Muslims. And it's actually, from our own conflict analysis, we go back to finding that for decades, these communities existed fairly harmoniously without major conflicts appearing from their faith. And so this is something that the Interreligious Platform has tried really, really hard to advocate, both on a national and local level, but also at an international level, that the roots of the causes are not actually religious and are not just formed from religious animosity. And there's a number of causes that they list, and it generally comes down to the fact that the current complex is complex, and the roots are in decades of negligence and marginalisation, and which result in livelihood tensions and general kind of dissatisfaction with the government and competition over access for resources. So I think that the Interreligious Platform and the interreligious reconciliation attempt our way of addressing these root causes through dialogues, through allowing people to talk about them. One of the things that we noticed was that people have different perceptions of the problem and different perceptions of the root causes when we brought them together. And so this also addresses another of Joseph's problems about the individuals versus the community, is that actually the work that CRS is doing addresses the individual's problems and addresses the individual's perceptions, and that's why they focus for the first two phases of their reconciliation approach on binding and bonding individuals within their own community and within their own identity group. So they can draw out these individual problems and individual concerns that people have and address their personal trauma before then bridging the gap between communities and addressing it at a community level. So I think those are kind of two of the points that it's important to make at the start, is that actually, in a way, the two approaches are not as and not a dichotomy as portrayed. It's not reconciliation or relocation. It's reconciliation as part of a wider process that addresses all of these issues. In terms of some of the challenges and some of the impacts that we've been seeing, I think they can kind of be split into three sections. The first is the kind of localized protection. This also goes back on what Veronique was saying about how you're addressing the context within the community. I don't think that you can look at the conflict and look at the humanitarian crisis in CAR without taking some steer, well, probably steer is the wrong word, but some kind of reflection on how faith has played out in the conflict. I think that because the current cycle of conflict is so entangled with perceptions of faith, perceptions of people of faith, perceptions of faith identity. It's really impossible to separate the two. And also, faith is such a big part of community life. If you look at the churches in Central African Republic, most of them are surrounded by IDP camps. They are the place where people go to find sanctuary. They are an established institution within the Central African Republic. So they are an access point for communities. And it's an access point that we can then use to promote mediation in that localised term. And there's been a number of examples of that where bishops have gone out into communities, talked to groups at the verge of conflict and been able to calm tensions. And especially towards the start of the conflict, when it was the Seleka who were committing atrocities against the largely Christian communities, there was a number of cases where groups of Muslims would surround churches of bishops and the papal nuncio to protect them from Seleka advances. And so actually the faith approach does have an impact in very specific and localised ways. The second point where the interfaith approach has had an impact is on an international level in terms of the advocacy of the interfaith platform. I don't really think that this can be ignored. I think it's a real credit to them that as a national organisation they have been able to gain this international presence and really push for peacekeepers, and it's something that they've been doing from the very start of the conflict. Recognising that actually reconciliation is just one aspect of how we can come up with a solution. They've called for UN peacekeepers from the very start, and it's something that then CAFOD and other Caritas agencies have been pushing forward at an international level to have a UN peacekeeping force, which we saw deployed yesterday. And the last impact that I want to kind of address is that the reason why we want to prioritise social cohesion now is for the long-term protection of civilians. It's something that we've seen as a real need for the future sustainability of the country and future sustainability of protection. It was highlighted in a recent report by the International Peace Institute that the success of the peacekeeping mission will rely in part on whether political and reconciliation strides are made, because that's the way of which you can get the kind of buy-in from the communities and address a number of the problems going on. This is an integral part of creating safe spaces to bring people together and also create the ideal situation to have people return. And so I think those are the impacts. Now, this isn't without its challenges, and obviously security for all of us is a fairly big issue. And it's one of the reasons why we've been working with Islamic agencies in the UK to try and bring them into the fold, to bring them in so they can implement their own programs there. And unfortunately, Driss isn't there because he would be able to give a bit more of an update on kind of how these things are playing out on the ground now. But I think that is where we're at the moment.
Thank you very much. So I think it just serves to illustrate the complexity and that you need to be looking at all these different approaches at the same time.